So good evening, everyone. For anyone who doesn't know me, I am the founder of MarketingKind, Paul Skinner, and welcome to this MarketingKind xChange, in which we'll be exploring how we can mainstream social purpose in enterprise. And we could hardly be in better company to do so, because we are joined this evening by Polly Mackenzie, who is currently Chief Purpose Officer at the University for the Arts, London, but of course before that was Chief Executive of the think tank Demos, which is the UK's leading cross-party think tank, focusing on bringing in the voices and the lived experiences of people who might actually depend on public services into policy discussions. Before that, she was founding chief executive of the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute and of the Women's Equality Party, after, of course, spending 5 years from 2010 to 2015 as the policy director for the Deputy Prime Minister, which was, of course, a particularly important time to play that role, given that the Deputy Prime Minister was a member of a different party to the Prime Minister at the coalition time. I best know Polly for her role as a commentator on shows such as Question Time and Politics Live. The French have an expression, l'esprit de l'escalier, to describe those insightful, witty zingers that you come up with just as you're walking up the steps, having left a conversation and it's too late to use them. I think if we were in France right now, we'd have to coin the phrase l'esprit de Polly, because Polly is regularly able to compress such succinct, concise insight, the kind that I wish I'd been able to come up with myself, but hadn't. So we're really excited to welcome you to MarketingKind, Polly. How are you feeling this afternoon?
Well, I'm a bit worried that you've overpromised and I might underdeliver, but I need to think of a zinger. I can't think of one.
I'm pretty sure that you'll come up with a few. And in my case,
my best.
Sometimes there is, in my case, also a satellite delay. We actually met after you'd been on a panel discussion. And just as you were concluding final remarks, the penny had dropped on a joke that you'd cracked right at the start of the session. I was wondering why you'd taken responsibility personally for the Polly crisis that we were facing. And then we finally got there with a satellite delay just before I introduced myself. But before we dive into your role as Chief Purpose Officer and think about organizational purpose and social purpose in enterprise, I wonder if we might take a minute just to think about how you see your own guiding purpose. I mean, you have such a diverse range of exciting experiences, as I talked through at a headline level in the introduction. And I guess it's that diversity that is part of what makes you such a great commentator. But how have you conceived of your own sort of guiding purpose professionally as your career has progressed? And when somebody gets to hire Polly Mackenzie, what kind of professional worldview are they sort of bringing with them in doing that?
That's such an interesting question. I mean, I think like most people, I stumbled into a career, and it's only sort of retrospectively that you can go back and post hoc rationalize what you did and make a story out of it. And that story might be true, or it might be simply myth making for yourself. And nevertheless, I think myth making is probably an important part of the human experience. So I didn't expect to be a policymaker. So I wanted to be a writer, actually. And I ended up, as my first job, really, working on a property magazine. And I ended up writing about tax policy and planning policy, and discovered that policy is super interesting because it is the underpinning infrastructure that enables good things and bad things to happen. And whilst so many people who are, I guess, purpose-driven or mission-driven in their lives find a vocation in helping people very directly, one by one. I mean, one of my sisters is a vet, for example, right? Like, she helps people every day. I'm so much more separated from that. But I do think that there is purpose in policy design and structure, because it is those underpinning rules and the way they get made that shapes the context in which anybody who is trying to change lives one by one dozen by dozen or 100 by 100 is able to succeed or forced to fail. And I think that is both intellectually challenging and also vitally important to get right. Now, I don't think as a country we do. And so writing and thinking about policy and how you get politics to deliver policy change is something that is, I guess, the core set of intellectual questions that I puzzle on during the working day and too often at 3 a.m. as well. And then what I discovered after leaving government, so in 2015, is that actually I'm also, I guess, an entrepreneur, but not the kind who makes lots of money and has a business exit and goes and whatever, becomes an angel investor, but simply in the idea of creating new things. And I think we tried to do that in government. We tried to create a new model of operating the government, trying to get two parties to work together. And I discovered that operating amid uncertainty, making a decision and getting started anyway, is something I'm quite good at. And so that's why I sort of found myself in, helping. Actually, I've seen on the list of people, my good friend, I don't think there's many Samantha de Solas in the world, but Samantha, who worked with me on it, helping Catherine Mayer and Sandy Toksvig to found the Women's Equality Party. And then from there, I went on to found the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute, where I also got to work with Samantha because she's awesome. And then my next job was at Demos, where I wasn't founding something. It had been around for nearly 30 years, but it was bankrupt. And so again, refounding, essentially finding a new story, a new business structure, a new set of trustees, a new operating model. And here at University of the Arts London, again, we've created a new function. I didn't create it. My boss, James Purnell, if you haven't heard of him, he's great. He's the Vice Chancellor, but also sort of former cabinet minister. He thought, wouldn't it be great for universities who are essentially public mission organizations to find a way to coalesce and organize themselves around the social impact that they want to have? And wouldn't it be a great idea to have a chief social purpose officer at a university? And that is a new idea. There are people with my job title, but there's nobody with my job title in a university. Now, it might be a new idea that's a good one. It might, of course, be a new idea that's a bad one. We won't know yet. But that ability to make it up confidently, not the Google model, not like move fast and break things, but move fast and learn things, I guess is my comfort zone. It's really interesting to just discover that the way things are is not the way they have to be. Sometimes the way things are turns out to have been a really good idea. But you never really know until you experiment, until you play. And so it's that combination of policy and playful innovation that I guess would be what keeps me going.
One of our members is Rory Sutherland. You might know actually as a columnist in the...
Absolutely. So I once, went to a dinner with Rory at Ogilvy, and it was really weird. They served these cocktails, and there was a cocktail which had a cigarette sort of in it. And so it came in a wooden box, and then you lifted the wooden box, and out came like nicotine-fueled smoke. I don't know if the cigarette was in it or if they just captured the smoke. Totally weird, totally disgusting. But other than that, it was an amazing evening.
The very first day I met Rory actually was in his club and the Ivy, and when the server came up, I just said I'll have whatever Rory's having, and it meant that I ended up with a combination of a peppermint tea and a cocktail called the Hammer of God. Really quite an interesting combination. But why I mentioned Rory is he specifically advocates for only taking on roles that haven't previously existed, so that you can make them your own and avoid a sort of tyranny of comparison. He's vice chair at Ogilvy, and he says nobody knows exactly what a vice chair is, what a chair is, but not what a vice chair is. So it gives you that creative freedom. And I wanted to turn a little bit to UAL because ostensibly they've pulled off quite a coup in hiring you and getting to hire you. So I was curious to know how it came about that you accepted that role, and also to understand a little bit, more deeply, maybe your motivation for that role. Is it, for example, being a little bit closer to a student population means you see the impact of your work a little more tangibly, for example, than some of the policy work that you described earlier?
So lots of things to be said there. First, so I'm sitting in front of a map of UAL. It's not quite on the wall, it should be, but you can see, can't get the side right. That's the London College of Fashion, and that's Central St Martin's. Then the pink one, Chelsea College of Art. We've also got Wimbledon College of Art, the London College of Communication, and Camberwell College of Art. I feel like I've forgotten someone, but I don't think I have. And it's such an extraordinary place. So, I bristle a bit at this idea, like they're lucky to have me. My God, I'm lucky to have them. This is probably, it's hard to count, but probably the biggest specialist art and design university in the world. And, like half of all Turner prize winners studied here. Plus we're like at the cutting edge of the future of the fashion industry, the future of participative public design, service design, material futures. We have a creative computing institute looking at the future of how creativity will work in virtual environments. Like, this place is awesome. So I maybe we're both lucky to have each other, who knows, but let's not overstate it. I was interested in this job partly for that same reason, because it was new. I saw it on LinkedIn, of course. I was like, that sounds weird. What fun. But also because my broader interest in the purpose movement, right? In this idea that organizations can't, the university doesn't really focus on profit, but can't simply focus on profit and its sort of immediate direct consequences of your actions. That if we're to have a kind of sustainable society and a sustainable state, actually, we all need to pick up what's called the externalities and the impacts of our behavior. We ought to think about trying to build up social and environmental capital, as well as building up economic capital. And I guess the sort of the neoliberal model, and I say that in a non-pejorative way. Usually people say neoliberal when they mean just people I hate. But the idea it is that it's there in Adam Smith, right? That the pursuit of profit, essentially, because everybody's incentives are aligned, leads to the maximization of human well-being. And I think that it's increasingly clear that that's not true. And the assumption that organizations can focus on building economic capital and then pay some taxes to deal with the rest is leading to this but we've just reached the ceiling on actually how much tax and public service you can manage. And so let me give you an example of, say, the obesity crisis, right? It's a reasonable policy point to say that we should have total kind of free market liberalism. People can sell whatever kind of food that they like. But if that's the case, we'll probably have lots more people with health conditions as a result of obesity. And so therefore we will need more funding for the NHS. And so the companies who are making all of that money will end up having to pay tax to fund those public services. Now, that's at least a model. It's a coherent model. You probably end up with 60% of tax revenue going to fund the public services you need if you have a kind of unregulated business models in that way. The alternative is that you might actually constrain some of those businesses, reduce the harms, and then actually you can have lower taxes. And I think we tend to think that, so right-wing people who go, I want free markets and lower taxes. But the problem is that actually free markets might need higher taxes. And regulation, socioeconomic kind of investment and environmental capital protection might enable us to have lower taxes. And that's a bit weird. Is that left or right? I don't know. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle. But so in my writing at Demos, basically, I've been talking about this idea that organizations needed to think much more deeply about the impact they have in the world. And then writing about that, think about, I see James Purnell, who I've always liked and admired, and who oddly enough had helped us at Demos to get this weird Keep Fit radio show for the over 50s onto the BBC during the pandemic, is advertising this job, trying to put that purpose idea, the idea that organizations might be trying to build multiple forms of capital into a university. And I thought, wow, that's weird. That's cool. I would love to apply for that. So that's what drew me in. And I was lucky enough to get the job at this awesome place.
Yeah, and there's so much I'm hopefully we'll get a chance to pick up on in that, but just drilling a little bit more deeply into what you've made of the role since taking it on. Of course, UAL is a champion of creativity. In a sense, if we think about purpose and creativity, I'd say creativity intrinsically is its own purpose to begin with. I mean, one of the best things about being a human is to enjoy your own creativity, to enjoy the creativity of others. But then, of course, we are in a world that faces really quite serious problems, from the climate emergency, collapse of nature systems, rising conflict, atrocious levels of accelerating inequalities. So I guess creativity has a lot to contribute as well as being its own reward. You know, what would you say have been the sort of key ideas or the key approach that you've developed so far in taking on the role, and how does that translate into a different experience for students, for staff, for other stakeholders of UAL?
Really great questions. Let me start with something that I cannot claim credit for at all. Our slogan, right, is "The world needs creativity." And I see behind you on the shelf, you've got John Alexander's book, Citizens, a great book.
We've done an exchange with John Alexander before.
Great guy. So I think that is an extraordinary piece of sloganeering that I love. Because imagine saying to 18-year-olds, you should come and study here because the world needs you. And the world needs you to be creative. And to be asking them to be what the world needs, that's so different from a sort of mechanistic, this is what you can get out of university. This is what university will do for you. Now, of course, our students would like to get jobs. And that's quite right. They should want to get jobs, partly because working is massively well correlated with personal well-being, but also because the creative skills that they have after studying here aren't of service in the world unless they are put in place, whether it is, you know, redesigning sustainable footwear or changing the way we do marketing. Nevertheless, so I recently went to New York, where I met the dean at Tisch School at New York University. And he was telling us about how they had changed their slogan from "you can be a star" to something about rigorous training for hardworking people, basically to put off the people who just wanted to be a star without doing any work. But if you contrast, like this sort of feels like 3 stages on a spectrum. 1, you can be a star, something rigorous training. And then at the other extreme, the world needs creativity, right? That is a citizen mindset, right? Like that is John Alexander through and through, and he didn't write it either. But to me, it's the question we should always be asking of ourselves as humans, but certainly us as an institution. What does the world need of us? Because it is so much easier for us to start by thinking, what do we like to do? What are we good at? Those are important questions. But if they are not compatible with what the world needs, then that's a problem, right? Like if we are, and that is what we are trying to explore as a university in terms of taking it into all of our operational decision making. What I don't want to do is claim that somehow, like, oh, before Polly started, the university was a rubbish and the students were unhappy, and now magic, woo! You know, change in big organizations is really difficult and slow. And yeah, it's just one of the reasons why I want to do the job, is to actually, you know, relearn what it's like to live in and work in a big organization. But as we consider the size and shape of our course portfolio, like what are the courses we choose to teach, we're going into that with that mindset that is not just what do we like to teach, what can we sell, but what does the world need of us? what are the creative skills that the world needs, and how might we count those and start to design our courses to meet those needs? That's really quite different from the standard sort of bottom-up model. But the big area which I'm focusing on, because again, it's something I've said a few times to people, is, it's being a purpose officer, social purpose officer at UAL is really different from what it might be at, British American Tobacco. Right, at British American Tobacco, you've got to what's the whole point of this place? Is we need to change it completely. Or even in a more, I guess, virtuous business, you're thinking about reorienting from profit to people and planet. At UAL, it's such a different environment that where people and planet and socioeconomic justice and racial justice, they're in the discourse, they're in the way almost everybody thinks here. And so the challenge is not to shift the values of the organization, it's actually to embed those values systematically into our processes. And like most universities, there is a kind of cultural, practical divide between the academics and the professional services side. And that means that sometimes the stuff we teach in the classroom isn't reflected in the way we run ourselves as an organization. And so we're looking at how do we, in fact, move our campus to net zero? Because what happens in the classroom is we really are teaching people at London College of Fashion, we're teaching people how to get the fashion industry to net zero. Well, should we really have plastic water bottles in our canteens? Should we maybe be a bit more biodiverse on our campus? All of those questions. So we're really trying to pull the values into the operations of the organization and think about, again, the way we spend money. I think that's something that every organization can think about. And it's tricky, right? And this is an organization that thinks it's virtuous because creative education probably is virtuous, right? It's a sort of good in and of itself. But sometimes organizations, and we've seen this in so many charities and third sector organizations, you're like, oh, I'm virtuous, so it's fine to abuse my staff or make them work really hard. Oh, it's fine to take on unpaid internships. It's fine to just whatever, buy the cheap tap for our marketing because it's for the greater good. And, actually that need to be thoughtful and purposeful about your environmental impact, the impact of the money you spend. All of that is true. And in fact, even more important, if you are like one of the good guys, you can't use the fact that you are creative education or that you're a trade union or you're a cancer charity or whatever to excuse bad organizational behavior.
I wonder, actually, just listening to you with the relations with academics and involving the students and embedding it in all of the processes. Obviously, you have a background in being a strong advocate for a relational approach to public services. And I wonder if that sort of collaborative mindset has supported you in bringing purpose to life at UAL. And perhaps you could also just give us a snapshot of how you've structured your social purpose group team, and also what use you may have made of something that I don't know how many people will have heard of, but there is something called PAS 808, which is sort of a precursor to a British standard for purpose-driven organizations. And I believe that you've supported that and made some in your own work. So maybe you could talk us through some of those nuts and bolts of how you've gone about the process.
How do we organize as a community, I think, is a really important question. It is something I've written about as a form of policy making. It's also something that we do at UAL. So we've got an amazing researcher, for example, Laura Salinas at the London College of Communication, who leads on community service design, participative service design. We've got, again, other design thinkers at Camberwell. We've got amazing participative work that we do at Central St Martin's, working with the local community in Camden. We've got a brilliant design leader, Professor Lucy Kimball, who works closely with Policy Lab in central government. So it's something we know about in our practice. Again, sometimes universities are not necessarily good at doing the things that they teach. But nevertheless, like right from the start, what I really wanted to do is sort of co-design a sense of what our purpose is. So I went round the university to anyone who would meet me. We did a big online session as well, and we did some anonymous surveys for people who didn't feel comfortable sort of publicly sharing their opinions. And again, really, I guess there's some sort of sense in an organization like this of, we're already a social purpose organization, what do we need you for? Just kind of reasonable. But also some people going, we do these bad things, like, for example, like whatever, this roof isn't insulated, or why are there plastic water, but we're not a social purpose organization. Well, and sometimes that latter group are in a sense saying that those professional services people aren't living up to our values. So I then say, well, can you articulate what our values are? And again, to be sort of exaggerated, the sort of is, well, if you have to ask what our values are, it proves that you don't have them. And in a way, I think it's really uncomfortable in a way sometimes to be able to really draw out what you think and what the values that you want to live by are. That is a process difficult. It's particularly difficult for very visual, very creative people for whom there's always a loss of meaning when it's translated into words. But, with colleagues, we tried to draw that out of people, because unless it's articulated, it's very hard to set it as a standard, as a kind of expectation for everyone to live by. I mean, that's still a work in progress, but, and in the end, you have to keep talking, keep participating. We're trying to build, we have a student union, we have trade unions, we have staff networks across, all of the different protected characteristics, plus like parents and carers, and we also are building other ways of, again, enabling people to come together as a community to think about what the university needs to change and help then be part of delivering it. Because in the end, we are a community and not a corporation. Universities are places of complexity where line management works very differently than it does in businesses. And that's a good thing. Like that's a piece of freedom that enables academic innovation, but it sometimes sort of impedes simplistic progress. So again, there's a book by Jonathan Grant called The New Power University, which really articulates very well this model of what shifting power away from conventional structures in an organization like a university should look like. And again, that's something which we're going to continue to push at. We do okay, but we can absolutely do better at engaging students. So it's students, for example, who've been in the lead of this work we've been doing to put climate change and decolonization through the whole of our curriculum. We've had student advocates supporting course leaders in that work, for example. It's definitely something more we want to do. Turning to PAS 808, I think it was released just about the same week that I started at UAL, which felt very serendipitous. And again, there are limits to its applicability in a university environment, which is a different kind of community. But what I like about it is it's a very structured way of thinking about how you get an organization to mobilize itself based on its capabilities and its expertise and its positionality behind, and it starts with the sentence, long-term well-being for all humans and the planet. And it says, if that's not your purpose, well then why not? And I love that. It's, we so often talk about things like that. Elephants have intrinsic value, or studying languages has intrinsic value, or swimming pools have intrinsic value. Well, do they? Usually when you push people, what they mean by intrinsic value is that it leads directly to human well-being or planetary well-being. Well, great. And that means that, in fact, we're all coalescing behind, I guess, a purpose, right? A sense that if you're not here for that, well, then change what you're doing so that you are. That doesn't mean we all have to be the same, or that you as an individual, Paul, or even me, are somehow responsible for long-term well-being for all humans on the planet. Like, none of us can fix that, but we can optimize. We can optimize for the contribution that we make. And that's really quite a different way of orienting your behavior. It's asking what the world needs.
I wanted to pick up on that because this sort of notion of human flourishing, I mean, you sort of essentially earlier rejected the Adam Smith notion that if we're all selfish, then somehow you end up with a collective good as a happy byproduct. And, you know, a lot of people that we've spoken to in our exchanges at MarketingKind have essentially led us to believe that the opposite is probably true. If you start with a spirit of contribution, you're more likely to end up better off yourself as a happy byproduct. But of course, you know, human flourishing, well-being, you know, one person's definition of well-being is different to another's. You know, priorities for well-being are shifting the whole time. One of our exchange guests was Alex Edmonds, who's done a huge amount of empirical research into what makes purposeful enterprise successful, and he does argue that enterprise that pursues a greater purpose first often does end up being more profitable as a byproduct. You know, whilst it is important that that is not the primary goal is the purpose, and that leads you to innovate and to undertake activity that otherwise wouldn't have occurred to you with a pure profit maximizing mindset, and that's where the advantage comes from. But he does point out that excellence is a requirement. So, you know, a nebulous purpose where it's hard to hold people to account, or where it's hard to know what excellence looks like, can be a limitation. What do you see as the sort of challenges and opportunities for purpose-driven organizations to scale? And what would it actually take, you know, thinking back to your policy days as well, to make a more purposeful capitalism a genuine new normal across the UK and beyond?
Small questions. First, I want to talk about well-being, because I just totally disagree with what you said. It's not shifting, it's not complicated. Actually, the UK is an amazing leader in the measurement and the kind of the academic analysis of well-being. So this is not UAL. We have not done work on this, but just down the road from me, about 100 yards that way, is the London School of Economics, which really has been pioneering at developing an economics of well-being under Professor Richard Layard. And I had the most tiny little role in helping to contribute to, actually it was a David Cameron and Gus O'Donnell initiative during the coalition years, to putting well-being questions, standardized questions, 4 questions into the ONS surveys. There's also another standard thing called the WebWEMS. And I hosted a roundtable about this just yesterday, which is why I'm like super up on particular well-being measures. And again, in the UK, we set up a What Works Centre for Wellbeing to really get into the weeds of that question. And an enormous tragedy is that it is closing in 6 weeks because the government boneheadedly refused to give it £400,000 a year, which is the most trivial sum. And so, I mean, it doesn't matter because the mission lives on, even if the institution doesn't. But nevertheless, like, the work is there, right? Like, we've got a really good way of measuring well-being, understanding what it means and understanding the pathways to it. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I was introduced yesterday to a brilliant diagram looking at the well-bees. So some of people may know of QALYs, which is a way of measuring a quality adjusted life year, which is used in health economics. A well-being adjusted life year is essentially a well-be, which is a way of measuring that has been developed relatively recently, again, in the UK. And State of Life, I've just looked them up. If you go to the stateoflife.org, you will find a Where's Wellbe map, which summarizes all of the evidence that has been gathered to date on really what the components of well-being are. So I talked earlier about, getting started amid uncertainty. Actually, if you care about maximizing well-being, you don't need to. There's just like bucket loads of evidence about what to do. And I can't now remember what your second question was, because I got on my, but oh yes, how are we going to systematize this? How do you get all organizations to shift? And it's tricky, isn't it? Because, we have Unilever, right, who went big on purpose, and then their shareholders got a bit grumpy and they sort of walked it back, not completely, but a bit. And, we see ebbs and flows in the capital markets as well behind whether this is great for shareholders or great only if it's great for shareholders, or, and then sometimes just terrible woke washing. We get the government criticizing that. I think in the end, I know, there does need to be regulatory change around the obligations of directors that are set in the Companies Act. Now, experts disagree on this because some would argue that the fiduciary duties that directors currently have enable them to think differently. And really, it's about changing business schools and changing the environment and changing broader regulatory interventions. But I'm not persuaded, I defer to others on the legal case, but I'm not persuaded that you don't get something by shifting the law as a sense of a full stop. But there are other things around simply just properly regulating the price of carbon externalities, for example, or thinking about the ways, thinking differently about health and safety regulation, which doesn't really encompass mental health impacts, and again tends to not think about wider kind of ripple impacts of organizations on communities. So there's a bunch of stuff. You can't just like magic bullet it with a single piece of legislation, but there are ways that regulators and legislation can create an environment which drives business towards a more purposeful mode of operating. And then, again, a university is not public sector, sort of not really a charity either, it's a weird thing, but essentially it's a public interest organization. And my hypothesis is that this purpose model, this idea of building multiple forms of value, is important in the public sector and in public services too. Again, it is, sometimes you get, oh, we're a hospital, we're doing something good, it doesn't matter what we throw away. It doesn't matter how we employ people. Actually, it does. Because what you're doing is you're creating demand for the impacts that you're then sort of trying to solve with the public service that you offer. So I think I think purpose has a place in public service organizations as well as in the private sector.
And maybe to sort of pull together some of these macro ideas around how we could change the whole of capitalism, and also the specific focus on the creative industries. It was rather before your time, but in 1997, Demos published a paper called Britain Renewing Our Identity, calling for the creative industries to play a leading role in sort of rebranding the nation. A lot of people are drawing parallels and contrasts between the present moment and the moment the nation lived through in 1997, of course. We are currently at a time when it does feel to a lot of people that as a nation, we've somewhat lost our way. We're a little bit on the back foot. We don't really have a collective vision of the national life that we're working towards and that we want to live our way into. To what degree, what kind of a future national life could we be working towards through this lens of well-being, for example? And how might the creative industries, fueled with academic excellence from UAL and elsewhere, sort of play its part in taking us towards that national vision?
So that sort of 1997 movement, part of which is I think rightly attributed to Demos, is sort of thought about as kind of cool Britannia, which again, just in case you figure this out later on Satellite Delay, is a pun on Rule Britannia, because it's really about soft power as well as economic growth. And I think there's lots of parallels, but also time has moved on, and you know, you can't just sort of reprise a Blairite model. I do think that the creative industries are an extraordinary British success story, and whilst I would be concerned about something that felt like just I guess a form of cultural imperialism, of just going, hey, British art's better, let's just impose it and sell it to everyone. Actually, what's extraordinary about our art and our creative industries is their diversity, and that's partly because we are such a diverse population, such an extraordinarily mixed group of people who make Britain and Britain's story their own, which I think is one of our greatest assets as a nation, actually. And the creative industries are capable of bringing prosperity to us. They're capable of more than that, though. They're capable of helping us to tell our story to ourselves. And whether the story is Cool Britannia, or whether, and Blair said, I think at the time as well, that he thought Britain was a young country, which is one of those things that's absurdly not true, and yet means something nevertheless, right? There's a sense that, you know, that we need a national story. And I don't think we have one at the moment. We are probably, this is a contested notion, but I think we probably are one of the most successful multicultural societies. And yet we're still pretty rubbish at it, really, because we've got diversity, but we haven't got nation building. And sometimes people on the left say that nation building is just a terrible thing, because how dare you sort of impose patriotism on everybody. And certainly if what you're imposing is a view that you just have to sort of love Britain, certainly as it was in the 1950s, like, God help me, I can't imagine anything worse. But to have a shared story of who we are and how we belong together strikes me as essential for the solidarity that enables us to live side by side with other people who are sometimes slightly annoying and who might be a drain on the public services that we are paying for with our taxes. You have to love each other. And I think that a creative story, people always, don't they, talk about the 2012 Olympics opening ceremony. But, you know, it was 12 years ago. And is there anything that comes even close to the impact that had on setting a national story? I don't think so. So for me, that's why we need a government that loves our creativity and our creative industries. It's for those two things, to help us find prosperity and our place in the world, but much more importantly, really, to help us know who we are. But anyway, I can't remember what your second question was.
What kind of national vision can we work towards, and what role can creativity and the creative industries play in helping us to get there? And I think, you know, you've addressed it in adroit Polly Mackenzie style. I would just to pull together like 2 or 3 diverse things that you've talked about. And you talked about multiculturalism, and of course, universities are increasingly dependent on immigration. And that's a story where a lot of what we hear about immigration is simply not true, really, in that, you know, over the long term, with an aging population, on average, looking over a longer period, we need more immigration, not less. But also at UAL, you have a storytelling unit. I think it might be in your team, the AKA storytelling unit. And this is very interesting to us and very relevant to the notion of, can the creative industries help us build a better story of the future? But you also talked about policy environments that are about enabling the right things to happen, right? And with storytelling, the psychologists have a notion of narrative competence, which isn't your ability to tell a story. It's, you know, used in child development and so on. It's your ability to read a room and a situation, to be able to exchange effectively with the people around you, to cooperate and come up with solutions that benefit multiple people in the group and that kind of thing. You know, it strikes me that at the moment, You know, the stories that govern us are really not stories that are told even by, you know, fantastic artists supported by UAL and the AKA Storytelling Institute, but it's the stories we're telling ourselves across society. And, you know, ultimately, if we have a more divisive, ineffective politics, a lot of that is likely that politicians are playing into a more polarized environment from the kinds of conversations people are having online, the way that people are reinforcing each other's views and so on. What might we do creatively to support an environment where we have a higher level of national narrative competence? I mean, I pick on the immigration example because it may have even been 5 former Home Secretaries have said to Laura Kuenssberg that the problem with immigration is you cannot tell the truth on it. We're probably not really confronting the reality of a climate emergency. There's certainly an awful lot of danger in terms of the rising threat of conflict around the world. You know, we have some very serious problems. How might we unlock more serious conversations and a higher level of national narrative competence in addressing them?
I like to think about the Chronicles of Narnia, and you'll remember that when the witch is killing Aslan, she talks about the deep magic, and there's something in that idea that there are these sort of underpinning narratives that aren't articulate. It's quite different from a story, but that there is narrative that underpins the stories and what feels legitimate and what doesn't. And there's a really interesting range of people thinking about how you might foster narrative change. And it is partly about having a national story. You know, the American dream is a good example, right? There's sort of 2 narratives of the American dream. One is about anyone can make it to the top, and the other is that everyone can make it to the chicken in every pot or the white picket fence, depending on what you prefer. But what's clear is they're actually very different stories, both bundled underneath the concept of the American dream, and they take you in quite radically different policy directions, because one is about shared prosperity and the other is about exclusive mechanisms of opportunity. But of course, both of those stories allow America to delude itself that it is a socially mobile society, which it is just not. To delude themselves, they don't have a class system. I mean, we have a class system in the UK, but at least we've noticed. So there are always these deep narratives. The question is, can you change them, and can you change them deliberately? So there's a bunch of people working on this. There's the Joseph Rowntree Foundation are exploring some work on narrative change, funding quite a wide range of narrative change interventions, to explore, I guess, the science of it, because it's easy to conceive of the idea that we do need to change our story, and hard to figure out how. There's also an amazing organization called Larger Us, run by a guy called Alex Evans, which has chosen a particular story that they want to change. And it is, to your point about immigration, this story of who we are, which is the we. Is it, you know, at one extreme, something that you might call the indigenous, God forbid, British? Or is there a larger definition of we? And, you know, what might it mean if the deep sort of the default narrative that we all had when we were thinking about us was a bigger group, a wider definition, a more encompassing part of humanity? And I think it's tricky for all of us to find connections to people who are different from us. You know, humans seem to have some sort of weird neurobiological preference for people who are similar to them. And this is just my atheist way of thinking of it, but I believe that humans constructed religions to help us find a story that enabled us to get over those preferences and build wider societies and wider abilities to function. And in a society which doesn't have a shared religion, and in fact has less and less religion, what is it that fills what Robert Putnam called the religion-shaped gap? And I don't know, but because there isn't a pathway from here to a single shared religion, I don't think, unless you're going to propose some really radical interventions. But religions do that thing, right? Like they help us, they can act as a piece of superego to help us go from that sort of type 1 thinking to type 2 thinking. How are you patient? How do you think about a wider set of people? And I don't know, patient philanthropy is probably part of how we shift that story.
There was some research came out of the Harvard Divinity School, actually, on your point on religion. And the 3 characteristics of a successful religion were bringing followers a sense of the beyond, a sense of belonging, and a sense of becoming. And that seems to coalesce very well with your sense of the new national story. I'm going to intersperse with questions from the group. So anyone, if you have a question, do raise your digital hand and I'll weave them in. And I see that Alan has been patient for the last few minutes with a question. So over to you, Alan.
Polly, I just want to say it's actually very interesting and as ever, I think very where do you draw the line in business between the profit and the purpose, and so my question is actually more trivial than that, which is the podcast you do, How to Win an Election, and was giggling away about votes for ghosts, and I was just wondering how scary is Peter Mandelson in real life?
Oh, not even slightly scary. He's like your nan, he just sort of, I'm sure if I were to cross him, I would be in trouble and I would get, the roasting I deserve, because obviously that, there's the reputation that he has. Though he's not the Alistair Campbell guy, he's much more likely to be patronizing, frankly. But, it's a great privilege, really, because he has amazing stories from his life in politics. People, lots of people have strong opinions about whether he's a good guy or a bad guy, but both he and Danny have been involved in a huge number of just places and conversations, and it's a delight, especially when I get to tease him.
Hi, Polly. Fantastic talk. Thank you. I'm wondering that a lot of the changes we need to make creatively are such long-term ones, and as politics is quite short-sighted now, influences of social media and having to be quite reactive, how do you feel that we can get these big creative decisions across the line when they're going to last longer than 5 years, when we really do need to change a much bigger direction than ones that will last a term of a government?
I don't think it's just the creative decisions, is it? There's how do we build any infrastructure, given that, I don't know, we've spent 14 years not building HS2. It's a fundamental challenge, right, in democracy, is how do you get out of the political cycle that elections create and get over short-termism? And there's one really easy solution, which is just to abolish that pesky democracy. But for me, that is suboptimal. And so the question about how do you create processes and institutions that are able to create a gravitational pull towards long-termism. And I don't mean long-termism in the effective altruism, like let's worry about people born in 3,000 years who live on 12 other planets kind of long-termism. I just mean like maybe 100 years, frankly 20. And I think the Climate Change Committee is a really interesting institution set up. Again, actually a great piece of legacy work by Gordon Brown to and the Office of Budget Responsibility is another piece of institutional architecture that just pulls away from the day-to-day and asks politicians to kind of like, hang on, there's supposed to be a long-term plan. Gives them the flexibility and the agility to adapt within that, but built on some kind of consensus view about what good might look like, just sets a bar. I'd like us to think more about the institutional architecture and also how you confer legitimacy on that institutional architecture. For me, that would be through much more participative democratic processes. And that, you know, I guess others would argue that that's dangerous because you're sort of pulling power away from democratically elected leaders in the moment. And in a way, for me, that's a feature, not a bug, but I can understand why it's controversial. You know, we got really sort of, as a nation, a bit pissed off with the European Union because we blamed it for all the bad things. And then we left, and it turns out actually most of the bad things were our fault. And we didn't get any of the good things anymore. But, you know, unless you're willing to sacrifice democracy, I do think that you need to just recognize that political decision making will always be not sort of perfectly optimized as it might be in, say, China, where you can write a 50-year plan and expect it to be delivered. And I think that's a price worth paying.
Teresa has actually put her question in the chat as the unmute wasn't working, which is actually going back to your studies, Polly, what you studied, and if the goal is working towards being a more successful multicultural country. Now, I from memory, I think it was Cambridge English. Is that right?
Yes, I did. I studied at a college called Newhall, which isn't called that anymore, but which is a women's college on a hill.
To build on the question in that case, you know, to what, in a sense, if you're studying literature at Cambridge, you're learning to read, except in a particular way.
Really fast.
With lots of underlining. To what degree does that translate into a better way of reading the world around us? And can you draw a direct line or even an indirect line back to your studies and studying great works of literature to thinking through how we might change societal narratives to embrace a better version of multiculturalism, or embrace a better longer term future, or embrace a collective pursuit of human flourishing rather than just shorter term self-directed goals?
I mean, I can. I'm sure it's at least in part post hoc rationalization, right? Like, partly I just got to sort of swan about reading poetry and sitting by the river, and it was an amazing 3 years of my life. But you don't learn to read, but you learn to think, and you learn to argue. And it's the ability to construct an argument is an absolutely vital professional skill in all sorts of walks of life, but in particular in leadership and in communications and in strategy, of thinking how different parts of the puzzle fit together as narrative or as argument. I did work as a speechwriter for several years, and you know, again, the more you have read, the better a writer you are. I think that's just basically true. And yeah, I've always been interested in stories, and there is, I guess, at university I started to be interested in a kind of a psychoanalytic frame. My dad's a psychoanalyst, so I think of lots of things as through a psychoanalytic frame, but around, you know, what it is to be human and the extent to which we live in these constructed narratives, and the way that might sort of separate us from a shared notion of truth. But I also got very interested in, you know, more broadly in the history of ideas. I did a whole paper on Milton, and you can't study Milton without thinking about revolutionary politics. And so I read around Milton, and I didn't just read Paradise Lost, I read Of the Tenure of Kings and Magistrates. And I guess that was, I didn't think I was interested in politics, but it turned out I was interested in 17th century politics. And and the idea of legitimacy, right? The tenure of kings and magistrates is about the question of the legitimate holding of power. And I think that it's a question which will always be unresolved, but is absolutely vital. I mean, 2015, obviously, I and my colleagues were evicted unceremoniously by the public from our role in government. And, that's democracy, fair enough. But it did force me to think really quite deeply, I guess, around this question of public legitimacy and the idea that policy making was just around getting the cleverest people together to decide because they'll make the right decision. And actually, in the end, so often in policy making, the right decision is the one we can agree on because it holds us together. And that's actually less important than some abstract notion of what the right idea is. Brexit, 2015, both of those experiences, I guess, taught me to be, or at least try and be, a bit more humble about thinking I have the right answer to the problems the world faces.
There's some things I want to pick up on there if I get the chance, but I want to give priority to our guests. So Jeff, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Polly. I don't know whether this is a direct question so much as an opportunity for inquiry. It strikes me so often in the past that major change in organisations and countries is triggered by those externalities that you started talking about right at the very beginning. And quite often those are labelled as negative externalities, Japan losing the war, Germany losing the war, the French Revolution, blah, blah, blah. If there is a basis in this premise that major externalities trigger societal change, what sort of almost safe major externalities do you think might actually trigger change?
Sort of benign catastrophe.
Yeah, it's sort of a strange concept, isn't it? But I don't want a war.
Yeah, could you have, like, I'd hoped with the pandemic that the ultimate COVID vaccine might come metaphorically in the form of learning that when global disaster strikes, you might have to turn everything upside down. But
or indeed Brexit, but that didn't trigger it, did it?
What do you think, Polly?
I mean, I remain intrigued by the question about where change comes from, the Tolstoy question of whether great men shape history or it's just the tidal waves of history that create opportunities for great men. I think lots of people look at that post-war period and think that what became possible with Beveridge and the establishment of the welfare state was enabled by destruction. Frankly, so were the concept of human rights and the ideas for the European Union. It's heartbreaking to think that we as a species might be so bad at learning from anything but bitter experience that we're incapable of change. I think the reason why more recent catastrophes have not led to a change in that way is that you don't just need a bad thing to happen, you also need leadership. And we have had a deficit of high quality leaders, unfortunately, just at the time of those crises. And so I think there's two questions I have in my head. The first absolutely is the one that's been asked. How might we catalyze change before the flood, as it were? But if that's not possible, how might we be prepared so that if the flood comes, it actually catalyzes the change that we want to see? Because the worst scenario of all is the catastrophe that simply leads to a downward spiral. That's a cheery way to think about it, isn't it? And I don't have the answer. I'm very sorry, Jeff.
Speaking of a deficit of high quality leadership, Preparing for today, I came across an interview you did when you were 29, not too long ago. But at 29, at 29, you'd said that you wouldn't stand for office yourself. You wouldn't vote for yourself yet. So just thinking about that guiding purpose and today's lack of high quality leadership, the obvious question is, would you see yourself going back into politics, but more in an elected role? Or alternatively, how do you see the sort of fulfillment of your own mission into the future over the longer term?
I wouldn't stand for Parliament for primarily selfish reasons. I think it's a terrible job. Paul Scully, Conservative minister, recently stood down, and there was something so sad about the statement he made around the change that he has been through from when he stood for Parliament, full of hope and optimism that he'd be able to make a difference. And, you know, like, his politics are a bit different from mine, but that's not the point here, right? Like, he wanted to serve, and it has cost him his marriage. 2 of his colleagues have been murdered. And it just doesn't feel worth it. I think it's heartbreaking. And he's not the only one, right? Like, we see people standing down for all sorts of reasons, and sometimes they're as explicit as Paul was about the reasons, and sometimes it's more private. But there's something so wrong when talented, capable people think that they would rather do anything but exist in our political life. I'm just not really a partisan. There's a very good book called The Political Brain that looks at the way that taking a partisan stance affects the way you think, so that essentially you then respond to your political opponents and your political allies with the emotional parts of your brain instead of the rational parts of your brain. And I spent some time being a partisan, feeling like, oh yeah, this is my tribe and we're right and we're better than everybody else. Actually, there is no single right answer to problems, and actually we're best when we collaborate. And you can't go into frontline politics unless you're willing to pick a side. And I see that we need people who pick sides. Like, I understand that. I just feel that my role, I couldn't do it. I'd rather be the arbitrator or the person in the background pointing out that whatever, it'd be better if we worked together.
But funnily enough, the last politician that we welcomed at a MarketingKind exchange was Andy Burnham, who's of course currently Mayor of Manchester. And one of the points he made is how much he has enjoyed somewhat getting out of that partisan mindset. And the versus, when he was in government, Secretary of State for Health, or his opposition roles, actually as Mayor of Manchester, he's able to take a place-based approach and unlock types of cooperation and collaboration that, and he still does the, London doesn't fund us, and so there is still partisanship of a sort, but he seems to embrace a type of collaborative politics that certainly resonates, at least in the abstract, with a lot of the points that you've made, and by and large has a certain sort of popularity, and is maybe, I hope, not exposed to a lot of the sort of vitriol that, with the Diane Abbott in the news today, and just so much that makes there's maybe a deficit of leadership, but there's also, getting back to narrative competence, there's the deficit of followership, and do we reward serious people in taking serious decisions? Polly, thinking about that satellite delay, I'm so glad that this is recorded, because I have appreciated every drop of your wisdom in this hour and a quarter, and the first thing I want to do is to listen to it a second time. For anyone who would like more of Polly, of course, the How to Win an Election podcast drops every Tuesday. It is not as good as our exchange, because Polly is diluted by who are also answering questions, as good as they may be in their own right. But it is definitely worth a listen every Tuesday for more of those zingers, even if you have to wait patiently in between them while Peter, Matt and Danny wax lyrical. If you would like more of Marketing Kind, then of course you get opportunities to work with your heroes like Polly and some of the other people we've spoken about. Polly, you mentioned the Climate Change Committee. As it happens, we have an in-person event later in the year with Lord Deben, chaired that committee, and Mike Berners-Lee, the environmentalist, on how we can improve the truthfulness of public discourse. Then please do look us up at marketingkind.org and consider becoming a member for anyone who hasn't already taken the wise decision of becoming one of our members. Polly, thank you so much. I hope you your bike puncture gets repaired quickly, and that your evening, the rest of your evening, is smooth at the Royal Society of the Arts.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.